Welcome, everyone. We will now begin the Globys Research webinar on payments. This thought leadership webinar will address the question of, did payments get left behind in the digital transformation? If you have any questions about the material, please type them in at any time. These questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, or a Globys Research expert will follow up with you directly after the webinar. I would like to introduce Scott and Carrie, who will be presenting today. Scott is the Senior Director of Product Management for Globys, and Carrie is the Senior Product Marketing Manager, also for Globys. Welcome, Scott. Welcome, Carrie.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that. So I'm Carrie Klaus. As Brian mentioned, I am in the product marketing side of the house for Globys. So before we jump into the topic of the day, I just wanted to quickly provide some highlights on who Globys is and what we're all about, just in case there may be some of those who may not be familiar with us. So the overarching driver around all we do is really to unify and simplify invoicing for suppliers and their customers. And we're focused really specifically on the B2B space. So what this means for Globys is bringing together invoices as well as all of the associated data from 5, 10, up to 20 different backend systems into a single point of access for the customer. So the goal is really to make it easier for the customer to access, review, categorize, share, and then ultimately pay, while also focusing on making it easier for the supplier to provide the invoice and then also process the payments. And it's really our patented technology around specifically customer-defined analytics, which makes this possible. So we work with a lot of really great brands to not only implement a better invoice-to-cash experience, but we also continually improve upon that based on market and customer demands. So our partnership approach really provides us with this unique opportunity to gather insights from suppliers all around the world, as well as their business users and the end users that are actually using our applications, which we actively leverage all of these insights to shape our product roadmap. And also we like to share these with our existing base in terms of best practices and ideas to leverage as well. So one of the new initiatives we decided to embark on this year was to actually kind of extend and build upon those conversations by establishing what we're calling the Globys Research Panel. So this group, which some of you are already members of, provides a unique opportunity for peers to come together to discuss a variety of topics tied to invoice-to-cash. So the goal, again, is to really open the conversation between different markets, regions, and even different industries to formulate some insights on what's really driving invoice-to-cash success, or what's potentially slowing it down as well. So as we get into the research findings today, Scott will actually highlight some of the data points that we've gathered from this group specifically, and we'll give you some more details on the end on how you can join if this is something that you'd be interested in as well. So hopping over to the topic for today, the question that we are really trying to answer is, did B2B payments get left behind in digital transformation? So this question really stemmed initially from some evaluation we were doing to see where our clients, as well as the broader supplier base, were focusing their priorities as well as their investments when it comes to digital transformation. So if you have a look at the stats on this slide, I'm sure the top one doesn't come as too much of a surprise and definitely rings true for the suppliers we're actively in conversations with. So it's essentially it's saying, of 90% of those that were surveyed in this cross-industry survey that was done, 90% of the respondents actually said that digital transformation is critical to forming today's business strategy. I would say the majority of initiatives that Globys is involved with are all around enabling a better, faster, easier way of doing something, mainly with a focus of, leveraging a digital platform and the latest in technology. So again, we continually hear that digital transformation is, noted as kind of a must-have and we must get there. And then as you see as the stats show, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced as well, taking that initial idea and thought and then building it out as an actual vision and then into a feasible strategy is where the drop-off starts to happen. So especially in the B2B space, there's so many dynamics and literally they're changing on a day-to-day basis. So it becomes much more complicated to, again, take it from that initial thought and then build it into a strategy that can be actually acted upon. And then on the right, you can see we've dropped in some numbers that show how these current numbers are stacking up to some findings from 2015. So again, although more companies are realizing the importance of enabling a true digital transformation for their numbers or for their customers and across their organizations, there really haven't been a ton of improvements on taking this to an actual strategy level. And then, for those who have actually managed to reach that point of strategy, the results are somewhat bleak. That 47% is basically saying that, less than 50% actually are meeting customer experience expectations. So again, for those that have actually taken it to that strategy level, there's still a lot of room for improvement and actually getting the benefits out of those initiatives. So we wanted to look at, what's really driving digital transformation and how are companies justifying their investments in this area. So these results are actually from a global survey of executives across telecom, finance, and healthcare. And it really shows their percentage of respondents and how they rank different influences on their digital transformation priorities. So I would say, as expected, and in line with the majority of our current clients' initiatives, the top two rankings are really tied to providing more value to the customer or potential customers. So customer experience, which is continually an area tied to digital transformation, really could fall into both of these categories pretty easily. Not falling too far behind, coming in third, is the opportunity to impact customer or company performance goals. So what's it going to take to impact your revenues, your day sales outstanding, your net promoter scores? Again, these are metrics that we continually have conversations around, and there's a lot of initiatives either being launched in discussion or, again, already tracking towards trying to achieve some of these goals. So if we look at the next question that was in the survey, it's kind of interesting because the results of where the investments are actually being placed, and again, this is from the same group of survey participants, the majority stated that they're falling into big data and analytics. And the challenge with big data and analytics is that it's a fairly broad and typically a very internally driven initiative. Not that it can or doesn't have an impact on the customer experience or company performance goals, but it's a lot less tangible when it comes to measuring the impacts. So on the other hand, we see the electronic payment and settlement almost at the bottom of the list. So the question is, if this ties directly to the customer experience and KPIs, why has so little investment been made in transforming this area? So, we wanted to know, is there a perception that there's too many barriers to overcome? There's not technology readily available to solve these barriers, not enough upside to justify the investment. So these are some of the questions that we started to gather and we wanted to bring some insights into. So just referring to the question about not enough upside to justify the investment, we actually believe there's a pretty substantial opportunity around invoice-to-cash, and clearly payments plays a big role in this. So billions of invoices are issued annually. Seems like a massive number, but when you think of large corporates receiving 30 or 50 invoices per month from a single supplier, it actually adds up pretty quickly. And surprisingly, more than 90% of these are still document-based. So whether paper, PDF, Excel, and the cost can be upwards of $8 a piece to produce and deliver to the customer. So on the flip side, when these are converted to a data object, that cost actually drops to less than $1. So knowing that the upside exists and then having some good kind of in-field experience with our existing clients around B2B payments, Globys launched a series of research focused on specifically solving B2B payments via straight-through processing, or STP. And essentially STP is all about removing the manual intervention from both suppliers and customers and allowing payments to be conducted electronically. So we've done a series of surveys and we've actually had some panel discussions as well with our Globys Research panel to gather data points and insights. And then we've cross-analyzed our findings as well with some recent studies from AFP that actually dug into a few of those key attributes that are highlighted here with STP. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Scott, and he is going to walk through some of those findings that we've had.
Thanks, Carrie. So given the size of the opportunity and the relevance of the opportunity around B2B payments for both our customers and prospective customers, Globys really wanted to research the progress of digital transformation of B2B payments. And really, we wanted to set a realistic benchmark. So we used STP and a company's ability to perform STP as payments as the benchmark for really transforming their digital B2B payments. And so, specifically in our survey and when we talked to our panel, we looked at 3 key attributes. We looked at the ability to send and receive electronic payments, automated remittance advice, and integration. So system integration, ERP, accounting system integration. And so these are the benchmarks that we set to judge a company's progress towards STP and B2B payments. So the sources that we used for this are our customer data. We also, as Carrie mentioned, we leveraged the Global Research panel, and we had them to respond to questions around STP that were asked to the Association of Financial Professionals so that we could get further information around these to really judge the state of affairs for B2B payments and straight-through processing. So looking at what our customers are doing, only 50% of our carriers currently leverage Globys for digital payments. And of those carriers that leverage Globys for digital payments, the adoption rate is slightly below 20%. And the other really interesting fact that we found was that 50% of a carrier's revenue comes from just 10% of their customers. And really, if you think about from a STP perspective and from a B2B payment perspective, it really highlights that, hey, most of the money comes from the enterprise. So if you want to affect days sales outstanding, enterprise customers would be a great place to focus on getting adoption there. And for OpEx related improvements, really looking at SMB, where you have 90% of your customers only driving 50% of your revenue. And so if you think about the churn and the all the effort that it takes to service those customers, that's where you would spend your effort around improving OpEx. The next thing we asked the panel was, hey, what payment sources do you accept? And really, paper checks were the most widely offered, especially amongst the panel, and as well as ACH and wire transfer. Which leads us to our next slide. This shows trends around paper checks. And I think what you note here is that reduction has really flattened. And reduction has flattened in removing paper checks at a time where payment technology has really improved. And so all of the trends from business to consumer technology, where most people have made a digital payment at home, it's quite surprising that given this technology improvement, that the reduction in paper checks has really flattened out. The next question we asked our panel was, can you convert your customers to electronics? and I think the positive thing is there's a very optimistic view that in the next 3 years that they'll be able to convert their customers to electronic payments. So while the results have been slow in the past, discussion amongst the panel have talked that there is great optimism to receiving electronic payments, which is positive because without electronic payments, there is no straight-through processing. The next area we looked at was integration. Is integration a issue from electronic payment and accounting perspective? And the short story is yes. From a panelist perspective, it was a major problem. But overall, even taking a look at the market responses from the AFP survey, it is a problem. And without integration, you really are stuck with disparate systems, manual processing, and really manual rekeying of data, which presents a large challenge to achieving STP. So again, can they convince their customers to pay electronically? We discussed this before. Yes, there's optimism around this. The next thing we focused on was remittance data. And the short answer is remittance data important? Yes. And an interesting thing we found here, and as we discussed this amongst the panel, was those companies that really lacked good remittance data found it extremely important, versus those that have already started to solve that problem found it less important. And so based on what we found is this is one of the largest problems in executing STP, is having reliable remittance data. The next piece is around what is the current state of communicating remittance information. And as you see here, there is a lot of email, manual processes that will require rekeying. It's disparate and inconsistent. And as you see here, it isn't always digital. There's mail, there's fax, there's third-party websites where you have to rekey it in your accounting system. And this inconsistent way of receiving remittance information really hinders straight-through processing. So, this question was really, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we specifically asked, hey, how are your initiatives around AR using straight-through processing? And as you can see here, it's very low. And given the other information that we looked at, the lack of integration, the problems with remittance information, customers still paying in paper checks, the fact that straight-through processing isn't being used widely in AR is not a surprising outcome. So the barriers, a summary of the barriers that we found as we went through and discussed this with the research panel and compared it with the market trends outlined in the AFP study, was that a surprising lack of investment is really one of the largest barriers. And it's really interesting because the payments is the second largest interaction that most suppliers and carriers have with their customer. The first being using the actual product or service. The next most common is payments. Next, the high operational expense associated with a poor payment experience is also a very large impact. The next piece is poor integration. The poor integration, the disparate and manual processes creates poor customer experience. You know, often we talk with companies that customers have 4 or 5 different ways to pay depending on the service or product they're buying from the same company, and this poorly integrated process really provides a poor customer experience. The other barrier to STP was limited remittance data. And without the remittance information, you can't post the payment and you can't recognize the revenue. And so this basically causes a lot of manual chase down of the remittance information so that the payment and the revenue can be recognized, really driving up the operational expense. As Carrie showed in the in her slide earlier, the cost of processing an invoice, this lack of remittance really drives that up. And then finally, really the other 3 above, the inadequate investment, the lack of integration, the limited remittance information, provides a poor payment experience. And again, as I mentioned before, this is the second largest interaction that carriers and suppliers have with their customers. And not only does it make the process of collecting your cash slow and expensive, in a lot of cases it provides a poor brand image and company experience by providing a poor payment experience. And so the question is, how do you break through these barriers? And so as we talked with the panel and we talked with companies who were able to break through these barriers and make some big strides towards STP, the first one was personalization. And this was extremely important because customers want to view their invoices their way. And by being able to view the invoices their way and quickly understand it, they're able to then quickly pay it. And by having an integrated process, suppliers are then able to receive payment with full remittance advice, and so they're able to receive payments their way. And so this personalization of the payments process was a huge factor in breaking through these barriers to STP. The next one is centralization, and really providing one way to pay for all products and services provided. And by doing it one way and having one experience, it makes it easier from an internal processing standpoint, but it also makes it much easier from a customer standpoint. So all products and services consumed are basically all viewed in one place, paid in one place, and all that information is brought together. And then finally is the automation around straight-through processing. And this leans heavily on back-end integration, having that centralized one process, and having your remittance advice fully automated. And so this is really a summary of the research that we did with the Globys Research panel as we were talking about the digital transformation of B2B payments and what some of the barriers were and how they were able to successfully break through those barriers. I also want to put in a plug for our next webinar, where we'll be showing some examples of companies and some case studies of how organizations were able to break through these barriers and provide STP experiences for both their internal operations and their customers. So at this point, we're going to do some questions and answer. I'm going to turn it over to Brian to select the questions.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Carrie, for the presentation today. We have a couple of questions from the webinar attendees for either one of you. The first one is in two parts, and it is, have any of your clients been successful at driving online payments among their business base? And what strategies seem to be the most effective?
I can take that one. So we've definitely had some clients who have been able to achieve, I would say, even over 50%, of their portal users now making online payments. I would say, it's a balance, as Scott had mentioned, between the SMB play and the enterprise. Obviously, with the SMB, it's a little bit simpler because their invoicing and payments processes are a lot more, or a lot less complex. So a lot of our clients actually offer a light version of our invoicing product, which really takes away some of the features that SMBs don't necessarily use within their payment processing. So things like customer reporting or hierarchies, and that makes the online experience, really around navigating directly into that payment workflow. We've also seen fairly high uptake of automatic payments as well within the SMB space. But with that said, I would, oftentimes there's a perception that, large corporates won't pay online, either because they have too many invoices or invoices are too high in value, or, they have all of these processes offline and they're not going to change their ways. Although the uptake, may be a little bit lower than SMB or mid-market, we do see some really large invoices being paid online. And I think the key around this is allowing them the ability to consolidate and divide those invoices as needed. So essentially what we want to be able to do is enable them to bring those offline processes that they're doing today. So again, consolidating invoices, allocating them, against their chart of accounts. We want to transition all of that into an online state, and then, be able to allow them to pay that way as well. So it's not typical that we see, a one-to-one ratio for payment to invoice among these really large corporates. Oftentimes we'll see them consolidating, upwards of 20 invoices into a single payment. And that's the real value that they get from being able to do that online. So in regards to strategy, I would say, the three things that Scott just touched on, the personalization, centralization, and automation, all of those definitely come into play. I will say the centralization one, I think, is one that we've been able to see some greater success versus some others that have not necessarily brought all of their invoicing or payments into one place. So our ultimate goal with our clients is to get not only all of the invoices in one place, but then to be able to let the customers, pay directly on those invoices in one place as well. So oftentimes, we've seen some really confusing customer experiences in terms of you get your invoice here and then you have to make your payment, either offline or in another system. So really bringing all of that together into one place, I think is one of the key things that has to happen.
Thank you, Carrie. We have a second question that's also in two parts. You mentioned STP as the resolution to the B2B payments problem, but that initiative has been around for a while. What's changed that makes this more attractive and attainable now?
I can take that one, Brian. So there are really three areas of technology improvement that will really help B2B achieve STP. The first one I mentioned earlier in the webinar is really some of the consumer payment technology is moving its way into B2B, and so because people have the trust and the experience from their consumer experience, these type of payment technologies are now moving into the mainstream of B2B. The second one is there have been a lot of improvements around ACH. And so these improvements in ACH should help expedite a lot of these large electronic payments and make sure that the remittance advice is received completely with this improved ACH technology. And then finally, the last one that we're really interested in is blockchain. And an important part to enabling STP is trusting the transaction, trusting the bill that you get, and then having that paid straight through. So Globys is looking at ways to leverage blockchain in its technology, and I think as a whole, as an overall technology from a straight through processing, the whole trust in the blockchain that's created with the whole blockchain transaction is something that I see really helping push STP to where it needs to be in the future.
Brian, I would just quickly add on to that as well. Some of the conversation that we had around the panel, specifically around some of the barriers, are a lot of manual inputs, data inputs being put in, whether it's customers making a payment and they're kind of dictating what data they want to include as they make those consolidated payments if they don't do it online, or again, when those payments come through, it's missing remittance data. There's a lot of time. And again, some manual inputs being driven by the internal teams as well, that kind of causes a disconnect between the payment and then the settlement. So there's some conversation around, even for those those customers that are not at a point of necessarily going to that online state for 100% of their customer or their invoices. How can we leverage this to bring some efficiency, even for those offline payments? So, one of the key things is, again, that remittance data. And some of our clients, actually, they'll have, even if it's a customer not making a payment online, they'll be able to still consolidate their invoices, say I want to make a single payment against this. And although it doesn't submit as a transaction online, they can actually create a remittance slip that has that information that's then available for the customer, and then that data again is also transmitted back to the supplier. So there's a lot of different strategies around it, and again, I think a lot of technology advancements have happened as well, and I think it's going to be not necessarily we jump from point A to point B. There's going to be some transition, and one of the key things that we're trying to look at is not only that transition for the suppliers perspective and adding efficiency for them, but also looking from a user perspective, how can we really drive this among the business space?
Oh, fantastic. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thanks to Scott and Carrie for presenting. For those of you who want more information on payments best practices, please visit globys.com and click on either the payments product page or the research page. There will also be a follow-up webinar in September that will show actual product and solutions for Globys Payments. And for those of you who want to be involved in strategy, brainstorming, and crafting best practices for payments and invoicing, please, as I mentioned earlier, join the cross-industry peers on the Globys Research panel. There's a link to it on the Globys Research page. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.